Greetings everyone. You might have heard of playstyles before. It's a term that refers to a certain style that someone uses to play or speedrun a game. A new player in getting over it might not understand what a playstyle is, and the differences between ways players speedrun the game, since all they see is a hammer frantically flailing about. And for good reason too, as the game is very difficult. However, as it turns out, by understanding, recognizing and learning about playstyles, we start realizing that playstyles are more than frantic flailing, because there's a long list of players with unique and creative styles of play, which you can both learn from and enjoy watching. Knowing how playstyles function and which ones exist, therefore makes the game overall much more interesting and exciting, since you understand the bigger picture of what's happening in speedruns, and how that applies to yourself. With that in mind, the goal of this video is to explain what a getting over speedrun playstyle is. To do this, we'll be covering playstyle components, which make up a playstyle, and determining factors, which affect playstyles. Then we'll build upon that by analyzing the two most well-known playstyles, which are called the boomer and zoomer playstyles. By the end of this video, you'll be equipped with extensive knowledge about playstyles. Let's begin.
I think the reason that I like getting over it so much is because you can do so many different things with how little you're given.
At the surface, a playstyle is simply the manner in which someone speedruns the game. Playstyles are developed subconsciously over time along with muscle memory, which is intuitively used when speedrunning. Playstyles are basically just an individual preference and approach to utilizing the hammer mechanics. In order to comprehensively understand playstyles and these mechanics, I like to divide them into three separate components: hammer movement, strategies, and techniques. These three components may initially seem indistinguishable because they are related, but you'll see that they still differ and certainly all have their own special function in playstyles. Hammer movement can be looked at in two main ways depending on what is being referenced. Firstly, the term hammer movement can simply be used to explain the motion of the hammer before, during and after object interaction. Depending on the player and their speedrunning background, this movement can visually look differently. Some players have quick and crisp movement, where hammer interaction occurs often. Others, instead, have a slow, smooth and precise hammer movement, where the hammer is moved less frequently. Also, some players tend to play with their hammer extended more, while others prefer to keep it closer to the cauldron. It's also interesting that the hammer can be moved very accurately, even down to literal pixels. This, in conjunction with speedrunning mostly being based on muscle memory, leads to every single player subconsciously developing a unique hammer movement which suits them. So basically, hammer movement can be an individual and unique way of moving the hammer. However, there's also something I call hammer aim. In this context, I'm instead referring to the skill level of the hammer motion, instead of the unique preference. How fast, consistently and accurately the hammer is moved decides the outcome of the run. With good hammer aim, mistakes happen less frequently, and you can move faster. Strategies and techniques, which we'll be discussing next, are limited in numbers, but the hammer can practically always be moved more accurately to gain further velocity. Therefore, hammer movement is the most unique component, and hammer aim has the highest skill potential. Speedrunning strategies are faster ways of climbing certain places in the various segments of the mountain, and in some cases they're even given a name, like slide skip. Besides that, strats can for example be far-reaching jumps like this Superman in Furniture. They can also come in the form of skips like Chimney Skip, but also smaller jumps like 3-tap Tutorial. These are just a few examples of the multitude of existing strats which all have different skill levels. Most strats are known because they are useful for speedrunning or have the potential for that. However, strategies alone are not enough to improve times. You also require adequate hammer aim relative to the difficulty of the strat to actually benefit from them. Strategies reference one specific jump or very small section of the game, and usually describe what the strategy accomplishes, as well as the skill level and usefulness of it. Let's look at the most common speedrunning strat, slide skip, from a strategical perspective. The strategy here is skipping slide in Playground. The low difficulty suits everybody.
Oh, hello! What's up?
And it's unquestionably the most useful strategy. I made a video about 15 speedrunning techniques a while ago, but I never really explained what a technique is. I just showed a bunch of them. In a sense, I incorrectly titled this video, because when I said techniques, what I really meant was the speedrunning moveset. A technique is the same thing as a move. This means that a technique is essentially a specific and set type of hammer movement, which can be repeated on several objects with similar shapes to produce momentum with similar angles and velocity. This motion could be circular, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, or even a combination of these. Just like with strats, techniques tend to be given a name, like pull pogo or no spin. The difference between techniques and strategies is that they refer to and describe different things. A strategy refers to one specific jump and describes what it accomplishes, the difficulty, as well as the usefulness. A technique can refer to many general areas where the technique is applicable, instead of one specific jump. Furthermore, techniques instead describe a certain hammer movement, more specifically, a set type of hammer move which produces the same trajectory outcome. However, techniques and strategies are still related, because techniques are used to both find and perform strategies. Now that we've covered exactly what a playstyle is, it's time to quickly look at what different factors exist that determine and affect hammer movement, strategies and techniques. This is important because it greatly helps in understanding the underlying reasons that playstyles have certain aspects. There is probably a lot more, but I've come up with 3 of the most important reasons that you can look for to understand the background to playstyles. These determining factors include mouse sensitivity, starting year, and skill. There's a phenomenon in competitive FPS games called lazy aim that can also relate to getting over it. The term describes a lack of willingness to aim as much as you should in order to play optimally. This is caused by using too low of a sensitivity, which requires more arm movement than what you're comfortable with. The result is that the arm is easily exhausted, which means that you skip checking corners, for instance. This same idea also applies to getting over it, but fortunately it does not necessarily have the same negative effects. Instead, mouse sensitivity can either make your hammer movement look slow and precise if you have a low sensitivity. If you play on a higher sensitivity, the hammer movement can instead look swift, with more flicks and frequent movement. Ever since Getting Over It was released in 2017, the speedrunning strategies have changed over the years. Due to the difficulty of the game, this shift in metas has developed slowly, which has made the time period between old and new strategies relatively long. In this regard, the year you started playing the game matters because it might be harder to switch to newer strategies if you've gotten comfortable and centered your playstyle around those old strategies that already work well enough. Likewise, newer players from 2021, for example, commonly use new strats which are relevant to that starting year, instead of old strats from 2018. I've already mentioned this a little when I talked about hammer aim, so I won't delve too deep, but obviously your skill matters a lot when it comes to which techniques and strategies you're capable of and how well you use them. Skill also makes playstyles more noticeable, since the player is more capable of showcasing their playstyle preferences. Whenever playstyles are discussed in the community, the words boomer and zoomer always pop up. These two playstyles are very talked about and quite frankly an interesting topic of discussion. Every speedrunner has a unique playstyle and every speedrun is unique, but they usually tend to fall in either of these two categories in some areas. So, what are the boomer and zoomer styles about exactly? In this section of the video, I'll first explain the properties of the boomer and zoomer playstyles in general and how they first appeared. Then we'll look at how boomer and zoomer playstyles can vary due to an especially significant determining factor, as well as compare the properties of all of these playstyles. A boomer in the context of Getting Over It playstyles is this: someone that was speedrunning several years ago, in 2017, 2018 or early 2019. As a result of investing either all or a significant portion of their playtime during these years, the players developed boomer playstyles that revolved around characteristic hammer movements, strategies, and techniques that were optimal and relevant for those times. So, what this basically means is that there are two requirements that need to be fulfilled in order for someone to be considered a boomer speedrunner. The first is that they need to have played the game in either 2017, 2018 or 2019. The second is that they need to have speedrun the game enough during those years to actually adapt to the boomer playstyle that was relevant during that time. It's worth mentioning this because there's some misconception that leads to misuse of the term. This misconception is the notion that you're automatically a boomer just because you play the game a little bit in, let's say, 2018. This is incorrect because it only takes into consideration the first requirement. It doesn't necessarily mean that you played for enough hours in 2018 to actually develop a boomer playstyle. The most essential and integral aspect of the boomer playstyle is consistency, which in this case simply means maintaining a consistent speed and avoiding mistakes. It's also worth noting that a lot of boomers haven't always had access to the modpack by Anjo 2, and therefore features like fast start and safe stating. This meant that many had to practice by doing more no-reset runs, which contributed to them being evenly skilled at the segments and able to maintain a consistent speed throughout the runs. The idiom, "slow and steady wins the race," summarizes the main concept of the playstyle really well. Overall, boomers use relatively lower sensitivities, which influences hammer movement. I would describe it as slow, smooth, precise and more calculated. Something which contributes to this smoothness is partially caused by boomers performing full swings, but also because they extend their hammer to create far-reaching singular movements, instead of a combination of smaller movements. The purpose of those big pulls is to decrease the margin of error. No-spin is a technique which involves not moving the hammer a full 360 degrees during swings, pogos and pull pogos, which allows more velocity to be generated and maintained in many areas. Because it's used in quick succession and is easier with a high sensitivity, boomers use it rarely. This means that boomers not only use full swings more often, but also techniques that several small no-spins would otherwise replace, like large max distance pull pogos. In regards to strategies, boomer runners tend to use older and easier ones which they are used to, so that they can consistently perform them. In order to further increase consistency, it's common to pause before performing certain strats. This is just to reset the velocity and make it easier, since it's generally harder to do strats with momentum. Here's a couple of notable examples of boomer strategies.
Ah oui, bah j'ai fait le même.
The history of how Zoomers first arrived and started speedrunning getting over it is pretty interesting. There's a reason why many Zoomers started playing the game in late 2019 or in 2020 and onwards. The man to thank for this Zoomer revolution is none other than Codyumm himself. You see, it was around this time that Getting Over It had a spike in popularity that was mainly due to Cody making several high quality videos, where he played Getting Over It with mods. These videos were both unique, entertaining and easy to understand, which meant that they reached a wide audience, in total receiving tens of millions of views. Obviously, Cody's success meant that some of his viewers entered the speedrunning community. This was the new generation of players that would become recognized as Zoomers. The way that the Zoomer playstyle manifested was that these new players tried to copy strategies that were too advanced for their level. Already in 2019, several top runners had achieved sub 120 PBs, which also meant that their strategies were adjusted to sub 120 skill. It's then no wonder that if an inexperienced speedrunner tried to copy all of these difficult strategies, then they would make countless amounts of mistakes during their runs, which is exactly what happened. It's also important to point out the fact that Zoomer playstyles started developing in late 2019, but they have certainly gotten even more pronounced and common as time has passed. One of the reasons for this is due to the fact that Zoomers have pretty much always had the mod pack by Andrew 2 available. At first in February of 2020, this meant that they could use it to save a position and then repeatedly teleport to that particular position to practice certain parts or segments of the game. This is called split grinding. The need for full runs to practice had thereby diminished. 1 year later in February of 2021, the fast start feature was introduced to the mod pack, which removed having to wait the normal 6 seconds at tutorial after resetting. This obviously led to Ctrl R being pressed at a much quicker rate. This, in turn, led to Zoomers being disproportionately better at early game splits, due to a lack of full game runs being completed. Split grinding and the fast start mod has had a profound impact on the playstyle, and accentuated it. At its core, the Zoomer playstyle is centered around speed and moving as fast as possible, while disregarding consistency. Therefore, it's the polar opposite to boomer playstyles. The keyword for boomers is consistency, but for Zoomers it is speed. A contrasting idiom to the boomer one would be the sooner the better. Funnily enough, the word zoom literally means to move or travel quickly, which accurately explains the playstyle. Speed and inconsistency are the two most crucial elements of the playstyle, so let's do an overview of how that impacts the components of the playstyle. A common theme with a Zoomer hammer movement is to use a hammer more often, with multiple smaller movements. For this to work, the hammer movement has to be very rapid. It's also common to see the hammer inwards, since it was realized that it generates more speed with no spins, but also because there's not always enough time to fully extend it. Due to the nature of this kind of movement, it usually requires a higher sensitivity, although that comes at the expense of precision, which could lead to more mistakes. However, the upside of this that compensates for the mistakes is the insane speed that this kind of hammer movement can achieve without mistakes. Worth pointing out as well is that because Zoomers make mistakes so often, they're usually much better at correcting them with small micro adjustments, which their quick hammer movement is adapted for. The difference between boomer and Zoomer technique usage is that Zoomers use advanced techniques more often, such as Supermans, diagonal pull pogos, horizontal wall pogos, space repositioning maneuvers, but definitely most important of all, no spins. No spins are what define the Zoomer playstyle. Without this very vital technique, the playstyle would fundamentally not function. With no spins, you can consecutively and rapidly perform instantaneous movements, which both build up and keep a lot of speed. No spins therefore go hand in hand with Zoomer strategies. Zoomers have had a massive impact on the strategies that you see in top speedruns today. The fact of the matter is that most strats are actually zoomer ones. Since all zoomer strats are very difficult, but not equally so, I'll categorize the following strats based on what I estimate their skill requirement to be. Some require your skill to be sub 130 to successfully use, and other strats call for sub 120 or even sub 110 skill. Then we'll look at how boomer and zoomer playstyles can vary. We've now talked about the boomer and zoomer playstyles, but there's still a small distinction to be made between these two categories of playstyles respectively. The reason is that despite two players being in the same category, their playstyles can still look very differently. You know, up until this point, I've mainly referred to boomers and zoomers as two individual playstyles. However, I think a better perspective is to see boomers and zoomers as two categories of playstyles, instead of two individual ones. To differentiate the boomer playstyles, we'll call one type the classic boomer and the other modern boomer. In regards to the two zoomer playstyles, they're just called zoomers or crackheads. The difference between classic boomers and the modern boomers, as well as the difference between the zoomers and crackheads, can simply be narrowed down to modern boomers and crackheads having better hammer aim. The skill level of boomers' hammer aim affects speed and which strats they use. Classic boomers use classic strategies that are easier and were popular in either 2017, 2018 or early 2019. Modern boomers certainly utilize strats from 2018 to 2019 too, except the difference is they execute those with better hammer aim, which generates more momentum. More importantly, they additionally incorporate modern zoomer strategies from 2020 and onwards as well into their playstyle. In most cases, this is caused by returning after a hiatus. Their slow and calculated hammer movement is comparatively not as well adapted to these strats as zoomers, which means that it might look differently when they use them. There are two types of zoomer playstyles that exist today. These are called the zoomer and crackhead playstyles, and the difference between these two is mainly skill and consistency. With a zoomer playstyle, mistakes happen frequently, while also occasionally zooming. The crackhead playstyle is based on the zoomer one, but the difference is that it has evolved skill-wise, where the hammer aim is superior. This results in the traditional zoomer strats generating more velocity for the crackheads. But also for the most advanced strats to be successfully used. On top of that, crackheads are also more consistent. These factors combined results in considerably faster runs, while also making fewer mistakes. All of the different playstyles I've mentioned both have negative and positive properties. Contrary to popular belief, I wouldn't say a certain playstyle is inherently bad or good, because that depends on your own preference and what your ambitions are. The most important thing is that it works for you individually, and that it fits your own preferences and goals. With that in consideration, I've created a list where the strengths and weaknesses, along with skill floor and skill ceiling, are compared. The way I think about those latter terms is this. Skill floor is the difficulty of the playstyle. Skill ceiling is the potential of the playstyle, and these are often intertwined. So, a playstyle with low skill floor and ceiling means that it's fairly easy to develop, but it doesn't have a lot of potential in terms of how low the runtime can go. A playstyle with high skill floor and ceiling means that it takes a long time to develop, since it's difficult, but it has higher potential. The strength which classic boomers have is that they're very consistent. The downside of those very consistent and easy strategies, however, are that they're slow, which combined results in a low skill ceiling and floor. A couple of examples of players with this playstyle are Luminan, Lochnes, Keranari and Wrench. These are a few obvious examples. It's still possible to be a 3-minute player with a classic boomer playstyle. However, Wrench is the classic boomer with the lowest time of high 1:14, which seems to be approximately the practical limit for this playstyle. Modern boomers use a combination of the boomer and zoomer strategies, but they still overall lean towards boomer consistency. Therefore, they are still semi-consistent, but also still relatively slow. They have a moderate skill ceiling and floor. To give you an idea of the skill ceiling, a few typical examples of modern boomers are Rossi, AS13B, Stillo and Rhetoric. Zoomers play very fast overall, but the weakness of that is the lack of consistency. It's difficult to be capable of zooming, but it has high potential. Therefore, zoomers have very high skill ceiling and floor. Zoomers also have the largest range of PBs nowadays, and exist everywhere on the leaderboards. Players like C7, Obamid, who is also called the CEO of Business, Banana and Friet, and Corey, definitely showcase the skill ceiling for this playstyle. Players with Quackhead playstyles simply have the best of everything. They are semi-consistent, but instead of being slow, they're even faster than ordinary zoomers. This creates an extremely high skill floor and ceiling. The drawback is the insane difficulty of the playstyle, which means that it takes countless hours to get good enough as well as being able to maintain that skill long term. This type of playstyle is by far the rarest, and there are only extremely few people who possess it. Peanuts, Leviathan, Excel and Yeet are some players which I consider to have Quackhead playstyles. And that's about it. To recap, we've looked at what a playstyle is, by explaining the playstyle components. In addition to this, the determining factors were described to help enlighten the background to these components. We've also brought up the two main categories of playstyles, together with the secondary ones that fall in their respective category. We analyzed as well as compared all of them. If you've watched this far, I thank you very much. To give a final word, I'd like to express that I think it's really astonishing that Bennett managed to craft a game so simple, yet one that also perfectly possesses such variety, depth and complexity to it. It's really fascinating to me how playstyles can vary so much yet be similar at the same time. The bottom line is there's almost no limit to how you wish to speedrun, and you can always improve, which is what makes it a great game. So, what does the future hold? Well, there are way fewer active boomers now than before, with zoomer playstyles being way more prominent. Perhaps the boomer playstyles will be forgotten about as time passes, and the Quackhead way of playing will completely take over. One thing we know for sure though, is that playstyles matter in the never-ending evolution of getting over it speedrunning.
Thanks for coming with me on this trip.